Дякую, що знайшли час прийти послухати лекцію пані Болью. Я зроблю невеличкий вступ, щоб ви розуміли, про що буде йти мова. І чому актуальна ця тема є, власне, саме сьогодні. Я дуже радий, що є люди, які дуже глибоко розбираються в тематиці українських виборів, знають їхню нормативну сторону і практичну сторону. Я думаю, що будуть цікаві запитання, буде цікава дискусія. Пані Болью приїхала з Сполучених Штатів Америки, з Університету Кентуккі. Її експертиза стосується виборчих бойкотів і поствиборчих протестів. Також вона спеціалізується по фальсифікаціях, по вивченню фальсифікацій, по сприйняттю фальсифікацій і по питанням сприйняття корупції. Відповідно, ця лекція сьогодні буде стосуватися, власне, другої частини фальсифікації і корупції. Те, що ми знаємо по Україні, по українських виборах, ми розуміємо, як відбуваються вибори, як вони фальшуються, ми знаємо технології, це достатньо досліджено, так само самі технології і ефекти цих технологій. Однак є ще така дуже важлива річ, як сприйняття цих фальсифікацій, власне, виборцями і громадянами. Тобто, які фактори впливають на те, як виборець відноситься до фальшувань, до маніпуляцій виборчим законодавством, виборчим практиком. Власне, про це пані Болью буде сьогодні розповідати. Я думаю, що десь ці приклади, ці кількісні дослідження, результати досліджень, які були зроблені в Сполучених Штатах Америки, ми зможемо провести якісь певні паралелі і подивитися, що ці речі десь можуть бути апліковані в нас в Україні. Отже, я передаю слово пані Болью і сподіваюся, що у нас буде така камерна атмосфера, дружня, і ми поспілкуємося на цю тему. Дякую.
Thank you. Thank you, Nazar, and thank you, Sifra, and thank you, Ukrainian Catholic University. It has been such a delight to be in Ukraine. I am learning so much, and I'm happy to have the chance to share a little bit of my research with you all. Just as a quick background on how I've come to have this constellation of interest. So I think Nazar might have mentioned I wrote a book about protests around elections, and specifically protests that opposition parties initiate. And the sort of iron law of opposition-initiated protests around elections is that they are accusing the government of fraud. This is just the pattern that repeats over and over again. And so that work that I did on protest as a response to election fraud made me interested more broadly in how voters understand elections and election fraud in particular, what they think about it. And so I did some investigation in that vein, which I will share with you a little later. But in doing that work, I also became very interested in how voters think about corruption. And the bulk of the work I've done up until this point has dealt very specifically with the extent to which public servants' gender affects corruption perceptions. And trying to understand why it is that consistently across a number of different countries, women are perceived as less corrupt than men. And in fact, in many countries, when there is a corruption scandal, women will be appointed or when there are systematic problems with corruption. So, for example, Mexico City decided to hire more women traffic cops to try to reduce bribery among traffic police. We see this in countries in Africa, countries in Asia, this sort of response to scandal that really what we need is some more women. And it's funny because the conventional wisdom goes something like, women are just more honest and others-oriented. But in fact, we think we've isolated some other stereotypes about gender differences that are more powerful predictors of that effect that women seem to have on corruption perceptions. But so what I want to talk to you about today is not that work. It connects this work I've done on perceptions of election fraud with corruption perceptions. To try to tackle, I think, a really important part of discussions around corruption, and that is, how do citizens understand corruption? And we can think of that in two ways, and the survey data that I will talk to you moves back and forth between these two approaches. One is to understand how much of a problem citizens think corruption is. But the other, and to my mind honestly more interesting question, is what political activities actually constitute corruption? And so, because we can have this sort of general idea, I believe the sort of standard, what I would tell my undergraduates corruption is use of your public office for private gain. Okay, but what is that really? And we know that a lot of politics are transactional in nature. Voters provide support to candidates with the expectation that there will be rewards in the form of better roads, higher salaries. There's a give and take that is understood, right? And so where that crosses a line from the sort of way politics operates into something that we call corruption, it can vary in different contexts. And this is one of the things that we're trying to do a better job of understanding is what do people really think corruption is? So here's what we know so far. I mentioned to you a fair amount of work that I have done along with my co-author Tiffany Barnes and a graduate student of ours named Gregory Saxton, that when you have women public servants, citizens are less concerned about corruption. This is true for either elected officials or bureaucrats. We also know that shared partisanship reduces corruption concerns. And this actually ties back in to my fraud work I'll show you later on. But also there's been work done, several Spanish academics, it's a piece that came out in Comparative Political Studies a few years ago, showing that individuals were, when they learned about a corruption scandal, but the members implicated were from their own political party, they were less concerned that corruption had actually occurred. And I believe the article is called Turning a Blind Eye to Corruption. We also know that when economic times are good, individuals are less concerned about corruption. And there's work done, I will butcher, the last name is something like Klasna and Tucker, and they run a series of survey experiments in Moldova and Sweden, varying different scenarios that individuals are presented with. And they show that under circumstances where the economy is doing better, individuals' concerns about what politicians are doing and the extent to which it might be corruption are reduced. But what I'm going to show you is that confidence in the freedom and fairness of elections also affects people's understanding of political corruption more broadly. So interesting to consider as a country that has an election coming up and a country that is obviously, I was lucky enough to be in the Verkhovna Rada last Thursday when the corruption court vote happened. So this is something you want to pay attention to, right? It's not just a matter of running a clean election so that everyone involved accepts the results and we get back to politics as normal, but there really may be broader consequences for how concerned citizens are about corruption more broadly in politics in the event that they don't feel confident in the integrity of the election. So the first analysis I'm going to show you comes from the Latino Barometer, America's Barometer survey. Surveys individuals across Latin America and some Caribbean countries. And it's multiple waves across over 20 countries. And so you get a nice, large data set to work with, lots of individuals surveyed. And they are asked questions about their perceptions of corruption. They get at these two different conceptualizations I mentioned. So they're asked some scenario-specific questions. They're told a mother needs to get a birth certificate for one of her children, and rather than wait, it'll take a long time, she pays the worker at the birth certificate office $5, the equivalent of $5 US. What do you think of that? And the choices are not corruption, corruption but should not be punished, or corruption that should be punished. Those are the options that people could pick in response to this scenario. Another scenario was a politician's unemployed brother needs a job, and so the politician uses his influence to get his brother a job. What do you think about this? Again, this is not corruption, but it shouldn't be punished, or corruption that should be punished. And then the second question is just framed broadly as how widespread do you think corruption is, right? So this gets at this more just sort of overall impressions of the prevalence of corruption in your country. There is another question that becomes important to really, I think, emphasize how important election integrity is, and that's a question of whether or not you were offered food and favors in exchange for your vote. This is, in the Latin American context, the standard, what we would call standard vote buying question, right? It's an attempt to frame it in a neutral way so that people will not be hesitant to answer because of social desirability. So it's framed in terms of things that people need anyway. It's not called bribery or vote buying, but it is interpreted by political scientists as essentially capturing attempts to buy votes. And we don't ask people if they accept it. We just say, were you offered? Okay, so first, these are coefficient plots from a regression model just predicting whether or not individuals would say those two scenarios were corruption that should be punished. And the vertical line shows you an estimated coefficient of 0, so no relationship. Dots to the left indicate estimated coefficients that are negative, so those indicate that individuals would be, with those characteristics, would be less likely to describe these scenarios as corruption that should be punished. And dots to the right indicate a positive association, so characteristics that would make individuals more likely to say this is corruption that should be punished. Those lines indicate our range of statistical confidence. So wherever we have dots whose associated lines do not touch that vertical 0, we have something we would call a substantively and statistically significant relationship. And so what I want you to look at are those top dots, because those are confidence in elections. So what that negative estimated coefficient for both of those scenarios says is that as individuals express a higher level of confidence in elections, they are less likely to see either of those two scenarios as corruption that should be punished. And you can contrast that with richer people think both of these scenarios are more likely to think both of these scenarios are corruption that should be punished. People who are paying more attention to politics, that political interest, with the mom scenario, they're more likely to think it's corruption that should be punished. The confidence interval overlaps with 0 for the politician using their influence to get their brother a job. Interestingly, women are less likely to view either of these scenarios as corruption that should be punished. Side note. Okay, so now let's look at a conditional effect, okay? So this is predicting answers to the question, how common is public corruption? And what we have here is we have both a measure of confidence in elections, but we also have the measure of whether or not you were offered food and favors in exchange for your vote. And we have constructed a model that interacts those two. And I'm going to show you substantively what that means in a minute. But for now, you can just look at the coefficient estimates and see that confidence in elections still has a negative association with perceiving corruption to be more common, as does the estimated coefficient on the interaction term, okay? But not surprisingly, perhaps, the estimated coefficient associated with someone trying to buy your vote is positive. That says if someone tried to buy your vote, you're more likely to see corruption as common. What does this look like substantively, though, if we use these values to predict actual probabilities? Here's what we see. So on the y-axis is the predicted probability that you say corruption is very common, okay? And the x-axis is your confidence in elections, which as the number gets higher, you are more confident in the integrity of elections. So what you notice is that, and then we have it broken out by whether you report being offered food or favors or not. So everybody gets less concerned about, feels corruption is less confident as their confidence in elections increases. Okay, consistent with what we saw in the last set of results. If you were offered food and favors, as we get to those high levels of confidence, you are more likely, and significantly, because we've got bands of confidence that don't overlap, you're significantly more likely to think corruption is a problem. But two things I want you to notice, okay? The first is that these values, these predicted values, over here where you're very confident, whether you were offered food and favors or not, are much lower than if you're not very confident in elections. That's just up there. So interesting to note that even if you've been offered, someone has offered to buy your vote, but you have high confidence in the integrity of the election, you're less sure about the prevalence of corruption than someone who did not get their vote bought but is really sure that elections are not fair. Okay? The other thing that's interesting to note is at low levels of confidence in elections, it doesn't matter if someone tried to buy your vote or not. Those you see, we've got point estimates that are very close together with overlapping confidence intervals, which says there's not a meaningful, statistically significant difference between those predictions. So the takeaways here are that at high levels of confidence in elections, you are less concerned about corruption, regardless of whether someone offered to buy your vote or not, than if you're very concerned about elections, if you have low confidence in elections. And at low confidence in elections, it also doesn't matter if someone tried to buy your vote or not. At the end of the day, it's that lack of confidence in elections that's driving up your concern about corruption. Okay, so we have those results from Latin America. And then we have another study from the United States, from the Cooperative Congressional Election Study. It's a wonderful study. It surveys 30,000 Americans before and after every election. And universities are able to buy space of 1,000 respondents. So get 30 universities to participate. And then everyone gets access to a set of common content questions for all 30,000 respondents if they want it. And then they get 1,000 responses for the questions that they developed in the space that they purchased on the survey. So it's a really nice opportunity. And this is the first of a couple survey experiments that I'm going to show you. I'm a big fan of survey experiments. I think experimental research is really wonderful, but often difficult to execute, often prohibitively costly. So programs in the United States that do experimental work invest tons and tons of resources into laboratory environments and maintaining subject pools of students, and it becomes very cost prohibitive. Survey experiments are relatively cheaper ways to leverage some of what's great about experiments. And so the idea, right, is that by having multiple versions of a question and by randomly assigning individuals to receive one of those versions of the question, if we see differential responses across those versions, because they've been randomly assigned, we have some confidence that there's something about that version of the question that is moving people's attitudes or opinions or responses. And so that can be very interesting. This is a very simple one. This one is not as interesting as the second one. Literally all we did here was randomly assign of the 1,000 respondents individuals to either get asked questions about elections in the United States or elections in Mexico. And we said, here's a list of activities that some people might consider corruption and some might consider normal politics. What do you think is going on? Corruption or normal politics? Okay? That's all we did. We did also ask about how confident they were that elections were free and fair. Again, in that country that they were randomly assigned. So 500 people answered questions about the US, 500 people answered questions about Mexico. And first of all, these are just mean responses, average, or just summary statistics, essentially. So 4 response options. Definitely normal politics, probably normal politics, probably corruption, definitely corruption. The dark diamond is individuals who are talking about the US. The white diamond is individuals who are talking about Mexico. So it's interesting to note that people have very different ideas about what is definitely, so this is definitely and probably corruption. So anyone who responded not normal politics, some degree of corruption, they're picked up here. And so it's interesting to note that there are really different, there are some differences in some areas where folks don't seem to think of politics in the US versus Mexico differently, right? So food or favors for votes, because again, that's the standard vote buying. What we see there is that a statistically significantly higher proportion of individuals who were asked that in the US context said, yes, that is probably or definitely corruption. A smaller proportion, suggesting on the flip side, a larger proportion of individuals who were assigned Mexico said, oh, that's probably or definitely normal politics. No? The other one where we get separation is personal use of campaign funds. And there again, in the US, that is definitely corruption. In Mexico, smaller proportion willing to say it's corruption. We see no difference in changes in election laws across the two settings, and it has some of the lower levels of individuals who are concerned about corruption. And there the question was, politicians are changing election laws to try to give themselves an advantage in the next election. And then we had a scenario with some ambiguity about voter intimidation, that a certain party's supporters were coming out in gangs to scare off voters, and that candidate was saying, no, my supporters are just enthusiastic. And so, we asked about this, what do you think? And there we don't see clear difference on either of those. But let me show you what happens when we do a statistical analysis and again interact confidence in elections with perceptions of whether or not food and favors are definitely corruption. Similar to what we saw before in terms of the power of belief in electoral integrity to diminish other kinds of differences, here the difference that gets diminished as we move from not at all fair to very fair. Again, how confident are you that elections in the US or Mexico, depending on what you are asked. And what we see is, in general, again, remember that the United States had the higher, more people thought it was corruption in the US. And so we see that at low levels of confidence in elections. But as we get to high levels of confidence in elections, we don't see a statistically significant difference between these two very different country contexts. So that confidence in election integrity essentially reduces, for folks who got the US treatment, it reduces their concern about getting food and favors being corruption. Okay? So what do I want you to take away from this first part? That confidence in elections can shape perceptions of corruption more broadly. So it's associated with a reduced probability of believing that small bribes or hiring a sibling are corruption and should be punished. It matters more for perceptions of corruption, the extent of corruption in society, than does being directly offered a bribe for your vote. And where we set up different national contexts that clearly elicit different perceptions of what constitutes corruption. It's confidence in elections that can essentially make the relevance of those different national contexts go away. So great, but we just, we've moved the black box back one step, because it's interesting to think that if people are more confident in elections, they're going to be less concerned about corruption in society. But what makes people confident in elections? Here's where my earlier work comes in. So again, a survey experiment. Again, from the CCES, a different iteration of the CCES, but it's a representative sample of 1,000 Americans, randomly assigned first to one of 3 scenarios. So they are told that in a neighboring state, either there were rumors of ineligible voters being registered, or there was talk that many voters were turned away from the polls, or that the state used electronic voting machines for the first time. And let me tell you the rationale behind these 3 scenarios, because I think that's important, because there's a more general point to be made here. These 3 scenarios were selected because from the early 2000s, they were the most prominent, they were the stories, the kinds of stories that got the most prominent media attention when people raised the issue of election fraud. So I did this at a time when, probably a year before, there had been a big scandal in conservative media about a community organization called Acorn signing up people to vote who were not actually eligible to vote. Now, just a quick background on the US system, being registered to vote is not the same thing as actually voting. You have to be registered and then go show up to vote. So it's not clear that registering individuals, it would be 2 steps, right? It would be the ineligible individuals would have to be registered, and then they would have to actually show up and cast a ballot. And the scandal was not about that second part. It was simply about the registration of ineligible voters. There's a long history in the US of voter suppression by doing things, for example, like not providing adequate voting booths in high population areas so that the lines grow very long, individuals can't afford to wait. You should also know the US is particularly terrible in its attitude towards elections, in that it's not a national holiday. It doesn't happen on a Sunday. People have to take off work. There are some very pathetic laws about, like, your employer has to give you time off that no one actually enforces or believes in practice. So there's a certain cost to be borne to voting in the US. And so it can be, the other thing that's gone on in the last decade or so is a move toward requiring more and more stringent forms of identification at the polls. So this could be another reason why folks are being turned away. And then in the early 2000s, when electronic voting machines were adopted in a number of states, there was a lot of concern about the ability to hack those machines and rig an election. So essentially, what I wanted to get some traction on was how much voters found these fishy scenarios that had been broadcast in the media to be plausible and meaningful to them. So they got one of those scenarios, and then they were randomly assigned to learn that either a Democrat or a Republican came from behind to win in that race. Which, came from behind makes it adds a little bit more, maybe something was up there. And then they were asked, how likely do you think there was fraud in this election? Again, 4 response options, from no fraud to I'm certain there was fraud. So let me show you how this shakes out. So keep in mind that the 2 random assignments are independent. So first of the 1,000, about 300 and change get one of those scenarios, about 300 and change get another, and then, independent of that, about 500 get a Democratic winner and about 500 get a Republican winner in their scenario. The program that's used is called Qualtrics. It's fantastic. It has a lot of, it's a computer program, an online interface, and it allows for a lot of randomization of surveys. It's really great. So here's what the breakdown looks like. So this is the proportion of respondents who were given any of the 6 possible scenarios once you take that 3x2 combination into account, who believed it was very likely that fraud had been committed in their scenario. So what's interesting to note first is that electronic voting does not cause concerns about fraud. Okay? Roughly 13% of folks who had a Democratic winner with the e-voting scenario and about 14% of folks who had a Republican winner thought fraud was very likely. That's a big chunk who are not extremely concerned about fraud. And those two numbers are very close together, right? So then if we look at voters turned away and ineligible voters registered, we start to see more substantial proportion of respondents who think fraud was very likely in those situations. Interesting to me and sort of heartwarming from the standpoint of like, how much do American citizens understand about politics? It's conventional wisdom that higher turnout helps Democrats and hurts Republicans. And so it is very typical that Republicans will accuse Democrats of trying to inflate voter rolls by, for example, registering ineligible voters or allowing dead people to stay on the rolls and someone magically cast their ballot. Whereas it is much more common for Democrats to accuse Republicans of voter suppression tactics, of not allowing everyone who wanted to cast their vote to cast their vote. We have seen recently under Republican state-level administrations in states like North Carolina, the slashing of number of days available for early voting, which obviously fewer days to go vote early, fewer people are probably likely to vote. So what I think is cool is that the highest proportions of concern actually map onto that combination we would expect, right? The highest proportions of concern are generated when a Democrat wins because there were rumors of ineligible voters, and when a Republican wins because rumors of voters being turned away, right? So to me, it's kind of cool that, like, on some level, American citizens understand some of these basic political dynamics that we see happening between the parties. Okay, less relevant for y'all here. I promise there's relevance for you in Ukraine. This is not it. This is. So we have data for all of our respondents on their own partisanship. So we can analyze the data by looking at whether the individual, the respondent who took our survey, identified as a Republican or identified as a Democrat, and then whether they got a winner by random that was from their same party, a co-partisan, or not. And what you see is a massive gap in concern when the other guys win, right? So consistent across both, it works the same way across the spectrum of partisanship. When a Republican respondent reads a scenario where their co-partisan is in the sort of fishy scenario, they're just under 50% likely. It's basically a coin flip whether they're going to see it as fraud or not. But if that Republican respondent got a Democratic winner, there's an over 80% chance that they believe fraud occurred. And we see the exact reverse when it's a Democratic respondent. When they get a co-partisan winner and a fellow Democrat wins, maybe fraud, maybe not. We're hovering right under 50%. But if it's a Republican winner, they're up to over 80% sure that fraud occurred, right? So these partisan attachments are huge shapers of confidence in elections if we're in a situation where there's any room for doubt about what went on in the election. And I will tell you that as sort of casual observation, I mean, we've seen an increase in elites attempting to generate doubt. I mean, like Donald Trump, I think, still stands by a statement that millions of illegal immigrants voted in California, for example, which is just, I mean, it's not true. Like, this is the interesting thing about election fraud in the US, is it's actually super, super rare. It's very rare. There are very few cases of it found, prosecuted. It used to be investigated by a branch of the FBI that dealt with organized crime because it was a useful way to identify actors in organized crime networks, not because there was a concern that it had ever gotten so bad that it was like affecting outcomes, right? But elites really like to talk about election fraud. They like to bring it up way out of proportion to its actual sort of level of concern and occurrence in the States. And partisanship is clearly very influential on the extent to which people are believing that or not. Interesting second finding. Oh, no, I see it on there. Okay. So remember electronic voting. Nobody's worried about it. Low levels of concern for electronic voting. Well, it turns out that's really being driven by younger people in the survey. And that in fact, as age increased of our respondents, they are as concerned about electronic voting as either of the other two scenarios, which is the case when electronic voting was not equal to 1. In other words, people did not receive the electronic voting scenario. They received one of the other two. And so, what do I want you to take away from this? Well, a couple things. So the first big point is that confidence in elections shapes concerns about corruptions. The more confident you are in the integrity of elections in your country, the less concerned you are about corruption, even when asked about specific acts that folks would maybe be tempted to label corruption. But then we want to take that next step back and say, okay, great, but what affects confidence in elections? Well, citizens' relationships to the parties matters a lot. Another piece I will tell you that I don't have the slides to show you is that political polarization also affects concerns about election integrity. It amplifies concerns. But some individual characteristics matter as well. And so I think those are the broader points to keep in mind outside. Like, a lot of this is very specific to the US context, specific scenarios that elites and voters think about in the US, specific characteristics like age of voters, and specific partisan attachments. But I think the more general point, so I do think that, well, and it's perhaps less true now, you could tell me, than in the past, but I do think there are sort of identifiable cleavages in Ukrainian politics that could function similarly to partisan attachments, such that a belief, an attachment to sort of one side, if you will, would make it plausible that the other side was engaging in election malfeasance, for example. And I do think that for you all, individual characteristics like age could be even more important given the shorter time period since independence and democratization. That means you have citizens with very different life experiences, particularly as you're getting now younger groups of voters who don't have the memory of political life prior to the fall of the Soviet Union. So I will stop there, and I'm really happy to talk about anything that you all would like. Thank you so much for your time. Do I still need the microphone?
Можливо, в когось є якісь запитання або коментарі, то можемо починати якусь таку нашу дискусію. Так, будь ласка.
Ви говорили про, що жінки менше піддатні до корупції.
You told at the very beginning that the perception of corruption from the side of the woman is like more easy.
Чи у вас якісь
Less
адекватні...
concerned about corruption.
Yeah, less concerned about the corruption. Yeah.
Чи у вас якісь адекватні дослідження чи причини, чому це відбувається, окрім того, що жінки краще за чоловіків?
Yeah, I mean, like the question is like, what are the like causal mechanism of this finding, and like the probably like the one of the mechanism could be that women are just better than the men.
Obviously, that is the right answer. No, it's a great question. So we have investigated 3 candidate mechanisms, and so the traditional thinking was women are more honest. There, it's the sort of, you know, up on a pedestal, morally superior to men. That is not consistently persuasive. In some of our research, that is persuasive to men, but not to women. The mechanism that is consistently persuasive across multiple contexts, across multiple surveys, is the perception that women are more risk averse, that women are less likely to take the risks that are needed to be taken to engage in corruption. The other mechanism that again gets some traction, and interestingly, this mechanism is persuasive to women sometimes, but not men, is that women are historically marginalized from the institutions. They don't have the right connections. They don't have the networks that are needed, again, to facilitate corruption. And that is something that resonates with women, but not men. So the consistent mechanism that works to So essentially, the way we figured this out is by randomizing in survey experiments candidate gender and stereotype trait. And when we characterize a man as risk averse, the gender difference goes away. And so that suggests to us, and when we ask people, like, do you think replacing traffic cops in Mexico with women will work because of, you know, this mechanism or because of this mechanism, that risk aversion mechanism comes to the forefront as what people we think are kind of feeling in their gut, what woman is standing in for.
I have a very general question actually with regards to your model. Like in your model, the confidence in elections is an independent variable, and then the perception of corruption is a dependent variable. But is there any space to speculate that there could be the reversed causality between like these variables, that people who perceive corruption to be high would be more prone to saying that the confidence in elections is like, their confidence in elections will be like on a lower level? Like, could you speculate more on that?
Yes, I think that is there is absolutely possibility that we're picking up an association. And so, I mean, really what we need is more experimental research to isolate. The trick is, right, we would want to we would essentially, I mean, I think we could do it a couple of ways. We could either try to manipulate individuals' confidence in a hypothetical election, or we could flat out tell them this election was not clean or this election was clean. And then see what they think about corruption. I mean, I think to be really sure, then we would also want to try the reverse, right? We would want to try to manipulate individuals' perceptions of corruption and see, because I think there is a possibility. Part of our argument, though, for why elections are influential, and I'm sorry, I didn't say much about this, but so elections are these moments when everyone's attention focuses on politics. And for a lot of people, it's kind of one of the only times they pay attention to politics. And so we think that there is a certain amount of power, whereas your understanding of what is corruption and how much corruption there is in your society, this is formed sort of over a long period of time, and it's going to have some potential variation, but elections just give these moments of sort of crystallizing politics in a way that most people then do sort of formulate opinions about whether the election matters or not, whether it was clean or not, whether the right people won. And so we think there is some power in that allows for those perceptions of how the election went to then be more broadly influential, to then essentially disseminate into our understanding of politics more broadly.
Yes, thanks.
Емілі українською назад нам допоможе. Мені цікаво, наскільки універсальними є ці принципи, принципи залежності, які ви висвітлили. Наскільки цей досвід, проаналізований вами, є типовий для більшості країн. Я собі просто слухав презентацію і думав про Росію Путіна. Оскільки в Росії Путін отримує 80%, всі дуже щасливі, ніхто не вірить, очевидно, в корупцію. Росія є, ви можливо, її не вивчали так як ці свої вибори, але вона якось вписується в це дослідження, в ці висновки, які ви зробили. Якщо вони там такі щасливі з цих виборів, то чи можна що таке робити з демократією, як сприймати демократію? Люди щасливі.
Generally, like the core of the question is that like it's about the Russia, like how all these findings and like your research are generalizable.
Yeah.
Does it travel? Like, and the argument here is that like in Russia there are selections of Putin. 80% of the people are like satisfied with everything, no corruption, everything is okay.
Yeah.
So how does it work in this case?
That's a great question. So I think, well, yeah, this is tough. This is a tough one, because as much as I think it's important to understand what citizens think about corruption. I think that's important. It's a separate question from the extent to which there is corruption, right? I mean, that's something very different. And some of the pushback I get on my work is, I mean, what you're doing is you're basically giving corrupt leaders the tools by which to manipulate public perception so that they don't worry about corruption. It's not the same thing as getting rid of corruption, right? Because it can definitely be a situation where there is corruption but people don't perceive it. This is the criticism of, plopping a woman into office after a corruption scandal. They say, well, it's just window dressing to make people feel better, while the real corruption is going to continue behind the scenes. So yeah, there's one issue here, which is how meaningful is citizen attitudes about corruption vis-a-vis actual corruption in a society, right? Because there's potential for a disconnect there. And maybe we shouldn't care so much about what people think. Here's what I will say to that, though. I think it's important, so I think a couple things. I think when people are very concerned about corruption, when people's trust in government declines, that's problematic for a regime. That's problematic for stability. So understanding that, I think, is important. But what I would also say is also the other thing. This is the truth here, how the sausage is made. Capturing actual levels of corruption, it's really hard for an empirical social scientist to do, right? Because it's all backroom deals, it's by nature secretive, it's meant to be obscured. And so the best instruments we have to understand actual levels of corruption are pretty blunt, okay? It's some cost of doing business surveys, Transparency International puts out an index. Like, it's hard to be precise about actual corruption. And so that being said, let's take for a moment that we can get some traction on actual levels of corruption. And we can see that there's a disconnect, right? Where people are a lot less concerned with corruption than essentially we think they should be, or at least that's what they're reporting. Then to my mind, that becomes the really interesting thing to understand. Like, there's a fantastic puzzle there, right? What is going on? And so, you know, off the top of my head, I think the complicating factor is anytime you're in a society with a fair amount of suppression of information and media, people are going to be less free to give their honest opinion. I mean, this is, you know, Singapore is time and again reported as the happiest people in the world. All right, they live under a dictatorship. So it's not clear how free everyone there feels to say whether they're actually happy or miserable, right? So there's sometimes a challenge when you are in a situation where people might have incentives to misrepresent their answers. But if we can take their answers at face value, if we think we have a good way to capture sort of actual levels of corruption, then I think observing a disconnect, right, between corruption concerns and actual corruption, that's fascinating. I mean, that, and, you know, we have some hints, right? I think the economic piece is one in particular. If people are generally feeling good about their material circumstances, they're likely to forgive politicians a lot more. I mean, I think this is why Americans have a lot of nostalgia for the 90s, right? Because our economy was doing great. It was doing great before the dot-com bubble burst. And so, the politicians are doing, you know, it's there, but it's not as, you know, it's not as much of a concern. But I just honestly think that to me becomes such a fascinating puzzle to understand. Like, where we see public opinion about corruption not matching up to what we think is actual corruption. Yeah.
Тепер про українську специфіку. В нас дуже цікаво, ми завжди останні вибори всі відзначають як дуже чисті, дуже демократичні, немає претензій ні спостерігачів, і ніби люди всі задоволені, але
About Ukrainian context, like the last elections are perceived as being like very clean and transparent and like everybody is satisfied with them.
Але рівень недовіри до політиків, до президента, до депутатів дуже стрімко зростає в лічені там буквально місяць.
But the level of mistrust to the president, parliament, politicians is just falling down like drastically.
Дуже багато експертів говорять про те, що Україні заважає зрушити з місця тотальна недовіра один до одного, людей до людей, людей до партії, людей до влади, але водночас, ну, дуже грубо, як можна, який висновок можна винести з цього дослідження, що рівень ворожості до опонента, рівень підозр в корупції є певним таким, певною запорукою демократичного розвитку і політичної конкуренції, якщо я правильно зрозумів.
So like one of the largest, like biggest obstacles that doesn't let Ukraine to develop is that lack of mutual trust between politicians, parties, and as well like voters, citizens, and parties and politicians. Like nobody trusts nobody, and it's assumed that like this kind of distrust is the guarantee for the democratic development. Like if nobody trusts nobody, then like everybody watches everybody, and so there's some basic level of democracy is like warranted. What do you think about that?
Yeah, there's a lot of really great research on the importance of trust to build social capital for democratic functioning. But it's interesting because there's also been pushback on that. So a lot of the social capital and trust literature comes out of Russia in particular. A gentleman named Jim Gibson has done a lot of work looking at the fact that individuals who have more shallow more shallow connections across sort of outside of families and across social groups, and sort of generally, I mean, there's a fun, right, the fun question is like, something like, do you believe most people can be trusted, or that you can't be too careful in dealing with other people? And so people who exhibit higher levels of generalized trust and have these sort of shallow network connections across groups also display more democratic attitudes. And so that was a strong finding, and that was this, we all sort of ran with this, gotta build trust. But then there's also this point, as you put it, sort of between the elites and the people, right? And in some sense, democracy works best when we're not terribly trusting of our elected officials, because if they know we're watching them and scrutinizing what they do, and we have the power to vote them out of office, they're likely to behave better, right? I mean, this is human psychology 101. The World Bank did a phenomenal study of money spent on road construction in Thailand. And they randomized, so they've got hundreds of road building projects. And it turns out, though I am not a civil engineer, there are various ways to measure the extent to which the quality of the road reflects you having spent the money as you should have, right? The thickness of the asphalt and the banking and different things. So half of the recipients were told, we're going to follow up with an audit after you're done. The other half were not. Guess who had the better roads when they went back to everyone and looked, right? And so there's been work done in Africa by a woman named Deborah Moeller. She has a book called Distrusting Democrats. And she makes this, so I think here's the thing, like about 1 million other phenomena in the social world, there's like this sweet spot, right? Where if you don't have any trust, it's going to be very hard to forge connections and cooperate and work in a positive and productive manner to produce the kind of results that voters want to see, right? But if there is so much trust that it's just essentially a kind of blind deference to elite authority, that's not going to be good either. And so there needs to be some way to foster enough of an understanding, but again, trust, or just trust in politicians, or trust that you have mechanisms in place to punish them appropriately. And so honestly, if it can work, this anti-corruption court may go a long way toward fostering that kind of trust, right? The trust in the institutions and their functioning, rather than necessarily having to find the individuals themselves trustworthy.
Будь ласка.
Продовження теми. Мої вітання, пані професор. Питання наступне. Мені також організатори говорили про те, що ви досліджуєте бої в парламентах. Перепрошую, бо частину пропустив презентації, можливо, про це було сказано. Але питання в ваших дослідженнях, кількість боїв і рукоприкладства в різних парламентах і кореляція з подальшим законодавчим спамом. Існує чи не існує? Тобто йдеться за те, там, де в парламентах не працює інтелект в достатній мірі, чи потім це виливається в прийняття маси законодавчих актів, часто якість яких є доволі сумнівною.
And the basic question is about the parliamentary role in fighting. So, could you speculate about the correlation between the amount and the number of these fightings and the quality of the legislative work? Like, if there is a correlation between the number of these fightings and the poor quality and the legislative spam of the legislative work of the deputies?
That is a great question. So, full disclosure, legislative brawls are why I'm here in Ukraine. I'm fascinated by them. I'm writing a book with a co-author who's an expert in Taiwanese politics. So the case that I can give you the most detailed information on is Taiwan, because we've studied it extensively. And it has the highest rate of physical fights in its legislature of any country in the world. But to your point, we have focused more on why legislators do it, why they fight. And so we think we have a pretty compelling story to tell in Taiwan. I will be honest, the Ukrainian story is much more complicated. I don't have a good story for you yet. There are bits and pieces that ring true with what we know about Taiwan. But so the things that we can show is we can show that there's a small subset of voters who respond very favorably to a brawl, and that those are the voters that are influential for re-election. And we can show that brawlers improve their chances of getting re-elected under some electoral systems, not in the majoritarian districts, but under list PR and under the bizarre single non-transferable vote system that Taiwan used to have. Those systems that require more effort on the part of the party, they do better. Brawlers do better. As far as what it does for the legislature, so this is fascinating because in addition to just finding it an interesting puzzle, my colleague is he's a devout convert. He's a white guy from Iowa, but he's lived in Taiwan for decades now and feels a lot of very strong Taiwanese nationalism. And he really wants the legislature to do better. Part of his goal is to figure out how to get brawling to stop in the Taiwanese legislature. But we have not been able to identify any impact, substantive impact on legislative output for this simple reason. You have these fights, and in Taiwan you have a lot of these fights, and they take up a while. Taiwan had one that went on for multiple days recently. But once they're done, you can, in a half-hour session, pass any number of pieces of legislation, right? And so the basic pattern, and I think there are definitely some times where this would be true for the Ukrainian context, is the basic pattern is the government is about to pass a piece of legislation that the minority opposition does not have the votes to stop, but does not want to see passed, and possibly even wants to draw the public's attention to the fact that the government is passing this horrible, awful, no good piece of legislation, right? So that's a very standard. So they go block the tribunal so that the speaker can't call the vote. And then physical altercation occurs in the course of trying to clear the tribunal to have the vote called. Often the vote is still called that very day. There's never been a case of a tribunal blockage in Taiwan successfully killing legislation. It has sometimes delayed it for a day or two, but it's never successfully killed it. The biggest issue that's come up is that sometimes, if public opinion really is on the side of the opposition, those brawls will trigger popular protest. And so that happened with the Sunflower Revolution, one very prominent brawl about 4 or 5 years ago now. And it was funny because there are so many brawls in Taiwan that there are very strict norms of brawling. So women fight, but women fight other women. Men fight men, women fight women. And it is understood that even though the speaker is wearing a microphone on his lapel, he must go stand at the podium microphone to call the vote, right? So there was one brawl happening, and literally the speaker was like, oh, okay, I'm just gonna go over here while y'all are fighting at the podium and I'll start calling the vote. And that was outrageous. He wasn't supposed to do that, and that caused, students occupied the parliament for like 3 weeks after that, and it started a new political party called the New Power Party. It was a whole, it really sort of drew in much bigger tensions, or drew out, I would say, bigger tensions in society that were brewing. But part of, it would be interesting to see, to compare legislative output, because here's the thing I'm going to say. I think in a lot of ways, fights are less costly to legislative output than some of the actual legitimate institutional tactics that the opposition can pull out to try to stop legislation or just delay it, right? So the opposition can demand a line by line reading of the bill where we're going to vote on it, right? That just drags it out for hours. And they sometimes do that, and that's definitely going to slow down the rate of passage in a way that, like a 20-minute fight that we then, maybe someone has to go off to the hospital. Someone always goes to the hospital. I mean, literally, I was there last December. There was a brawl. A woman who I saw on the equivalent of the Rada TV, like Taiwan has its, legislature TV, like off in the corner adjusting her ponytail, was then later reported to have had to go to the hospital. It's a lot, but it's a lot of theatrics, and it's a lot of we would say signaling, right? It's not a lot of substance typically, but I don't think it actually has much substantive effect on the legislative process. But it does reveal, I think, some very important things about how a legislature is working. Yeah.
May I ask you a question from the American context?
Yes.
In your presentation, you mentioned that there is no systematic findings about the massive rigging of the elections in 2014, but 2016, pardon.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the core messages of Trump was that elections are rigged. Millions of people voted.
If he loses, it will be because it's rigged.
Exactly. But the point here is that there was a set of polling surveys after the elections showing up that Republicans and supporters of Trump did really believe in all the stuff. They were really responsible in believing that their elections could be rigged, etc., etc.
One lady was so sure that she actually voted twice.
Yeah.
A Trump supporter actually committed election fraud on the justification that she had been told it was going to happen.
This question is very, probably it's naive for American context, but for Ukrainian context it's not so naive. The point is that it assumes that American voter is very sophisticated, reasonable, they are picking arguments and decide very cautiously how to vote, etc. So how did it happen that such a sophisticated and reasonable voter, without any reason, any systematic evidence, could just buy this cheap talk from Trump? How dangerous it is, and what could be the probable consequences for 2020 elections, with all this rhetoric, if Trump would be able to use it once again?
This is taking me down a dark road, Nazar. So first of all, political psychologists have identified a phenomenon we call motivated reasoning, that humans are very good at thinking logically, but that it's a skill we actually developed to win arguments and survive, not so that we can actually identify some objective truth. And I think we see this so strongly today in politics that very implausible or complex arguments can be believed, and we might think of that as being, some unsophisticated voters. But in fact, I think a lot of what's going on is a high degree of motivated reasoning. Because it's not just that it's massive fraud, right? It's massive fraud being committed by illegal immigrants. And we know, of course, that another part of Trump's rhetoric is about the rapists and drug dealers that all of Mexicans are, apparently. That was said totally tongue-in-cheek. I don't think Mexicans are rapists or drug dealers any more than any other person might be. But white Americans are feeling very insecure. And so Trump's campaign rhetoric is perfectly crafted to tap into that insecurity and to foment a conviction that really anything is plausible. If a person with brown skin, if a person who is a Muslim did it, I'm likely to believe that if you say that happened, I'm sure that happened. I mean, one of the really interesting things about where the belief in fraud shows up and how it plays out is when you ask people, do you believe there was fraud? Yeah, Did you see it? No, it happened in other places. It happened out in California, right? Because there's the Inland Empire, you got some Trump supporters there, I'm sure, but by and large, most Californians are staunch, it always goes Democrat, right? And so it's an easy target to sort of signal to the bulk of Middle America about, to again, stoke those fears and those animosities. But I'm less concerned about the rhetoric than I am about some of the actual legislative decisions that are happening. I mean, I say legislative, it was actually a Supreme Court ruling just 2 days ago that now allows, decided it was constitutional for the state of Ohio to purge individuals from voter rolls, because remember, you have to register and be on a voter roll and then go vote. You're not automatically registered to vote. They are allowed, if you don't vote in 2 consecutive elections, the state of Ohio can drop you from the voter roll. And so, more concerning to me than the rhetoric, or maybe in conjunction with the rhetoric, is the fact that there are some pretty serious, changes in election administration that are going to have real consequences for who gets to cast a ballot.
My question is about methodology. In sociological studies, we used to have 2 variables. One is trust to politician, another is estimation of his efficiency. The issue came from Eastern Europe in the 90s. I remember that in Poland there was a dispute that sometimes you trust a politician, but you will not vote because you do not believe he is strong enough to combat corruption, which has been always an issue. First of the communist leaders, which still were operating in the 90s, later something else. So would you see any sense to include, to differentiate these 2 variables, efficiency of politician and trust to him?
I absolutely, and I think that is brilliant, because yes, I think oftentimes there is a perception that politics, again, and this is where that question of what is corruption becomes important. There's often a perception that what it takes to be a good politician is not synonymous with actually being a good person, right? That there is a skill set that maybe means making some difficult choices, making some ethical trade-offs, making some ethically questionable decisions, that's kind of part of that job, right? And so one thing that we've worried about in our construction that we would like to refine, it gets at this exactly, it's that by asking, do you think this is corruption or do you think this is normal politics? Well, what if you think normal politics are just super corrupt? Like, what if your understanding of what, right? Like, what if corruption is baked in to what you think happens in politics? And this is not inconsequential, right? Like, if you look at what happened in Brazil with the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, she was impeached for manipulating accounts and reports of budgetary matters in advance of an election to make herself look better. And her response when she was caught was, literally everyone has been doing this for decades. Like, this is what we do. This is not, this is not unethical. It's like, it's a little fudgy, but everyone does it, right? And so I think, yes, trying to tease out something like how much it mattered, like how much you're willing to tolerate for politicians who are effective, how much you think corruption inhibits politicians doing a better or worse job. This is, I think there is room for debate here. Like, I think, for example, throughout Latin America, the political economy literature always emphasizes that clientelistic, patronage-based exchanges are very inefficient and bad for the economy. But money's changing hands, stuff is getting done. At the end of the day, I think it's an open question, sort of the extent to which we want to consider separate dimensions of clean politicians, effective politicians, and where citizens place their value. I sound terribly Machiavellian. I can't help it. I like Machiavelli.
Просив би повернутися там, де мексикансько-американські.
Can you get back to the slides with the American and Mexican stuff?
Yes. This one? This one?
Is that one?
Якщо я правильно розумію, ці риски навколо пункту, це є наскільки розподіляються голоси.
No. Yeah.
Confidence intervals? Yeah. Oh, no. So that is the proportion of, so,
Дивись.
yeah. Mhm.
Назад, ми ж
So to some extent it is distribution.
Наскільки я розумію, що оце це є середньозважено, так?
Is it the average?
Це є межі самих відповідей на то чи інше
No.
Ні, це статистичні речі.
These were constructed with t-tests, and so those are the confidence intervals. These are using t-values and the confidence intervals around them. Yeah, so it's not the range of responses. Thank you for that. Thank you for that clarification. One
Ще
more.
одне питання. Того пункту, там, де були
At the very beginning, slide at the very beginning. That one.
А чи я правильно розумію, що з збільшенням участі в виборах росте віра в чесність, не в корумпованість виборів? Що з 1 по 7 це кількість?
Ні, це з 1 по 7 це шкала певності в тому, що вибори є чесно.
Got it. Some clarification.
Fantastic.
One question.
My question is, when you speak about confidence in the election, does that include, of course it includes the citizens or the voters being sure that the elections are not rigged, but does this include also voters' perception of their influence in politics? Like, does their vote matter?
Efficacy.
Yeah.
It does not. It does not. The standard question that is asked is how confident are you that your vote was counted accurately? And that gets at both, it gets at administrative capacity and functioning, but also it's assumed that if you are worried about fraud, you're going to be less confident that your vote was counted accurately, right? And so it does not get at how much do you think your vote matters. I have some other work done, though, that speaks to that question of efficacy. And one thing that's really neat about it is, so it's work on, in the state of Kentucky, there's a law that once you've been convicted of a felony, even after you're released from prison, except under very, very particular special circumstances where you have to go ask the governor of the state directly, you'll never get your right to vote back. You're effectively permanently stripped of your right to vote. And so I've been interested in kind of the broader political engagement consequences of this. So we did a survey experiment where one of the things we varied was we asked individuals to imagine that they were in a legislative district, a majoritarian district, where it wasn't clear who was going to win. And we asked others to imagine that they were in a district where the winner was a foregone conclusion. And we asked about how likely you'd be to turn out, how much you think your vote matters, how much you think it matters what people like you do or want in politics. And there's a really nice, clear decrease in beliefs about efficacy in uncompetitive situations. So voters can understand that, but typically efficacy is not captured when we talk about election integrity. That although there's a dimension where you could imagine if I think the election's rigged, I probably also think my vote doesn't matter as much.
Could you speculate what would be perception of corruption by the by the voter who believes or doesn't believe that his vote matters?
That's a good question. I don't off the top of my head see. I mean, my guess would be if I don't believe my vote matters, I probably attribute the way politics works to other forces outside of my control. So I might perceive more sort of high-level corruption being what drives politics if I really don't believe that my vote matters. And the analogy I'm drawing on here, honestly, is that African Americans who tend, with good reason, to feel that their votes don't matter, often because they are taken away, also have higher rates of belief in conspiracy theories than other racial groups in the US. And I think I could see a similar logic there, right? Like if you don't see a direct translation of the political work you do into outcomes, you imagine some other stuff has to be going on behind the scenes or out of your view. Yeah, I would expect that, but I'm not sure.
May I a little bit continue my question? So why I'm asking this is because I'm interested in the effects of electoral systems, and there's a number of studies that show that it sometimes depends on the electoral system whether the citizens or the voters believe their vote matters or not. So
Yeah.
I can imagine in the US when there is an uncontested state, then there is little belief in the effectiveness of the vote.
Yes.
And then there is this movement to introduce proportional voting and so on. I was just thinking whether in order to decrease the perception of corruption, the government or those in power might speculate or might try to introduce an electoral system which is perceived by the voters as more empowering. For example, by changing from plurality vote to, let's say, two-round majority, which is perceived as more empowering, but in fact is not always so, but it is perceived so. Yes, so just my speculation.
And so I think the Leiphardt's classical work showed the correlation between more consociational systems, typically with PR, and lower levels of corruption. And so there may be something there. You may be onto something. What I would say about politicians potentially changing the electoral system to improve citizen perceptions is it won't happen. That won't happen. Politicians change electoral systems when it facilitates their political survival. I mean, we know this, right? The wave of shift from majoritarian to PR across Europe was because conservative parties saw unions, they saw the working class getting the right to vote, and they realized that if they didn't shift things so they could hold a sliver of the pie, it was never going to happen. So unless parties see some benefit in the US, so you could imagine, like, if there was a strong third party that came on the scene, that might be a situation but that's what it's going to take to get electoral system reform. Yeah, the current power holders have to see a possible benefit.
Ще можливо у когось є запитання? Добре, якщо є, то дякую всім за запитання, дякую за те, що прийшли. Давайте подякуємо Емілі за те, що
Thank you all so much. Thank you.